Thank you, and thank you for having me. I am excited to talk a little bit about my research and my book. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, Kugel and Frijoles, Latino Jews in the United States. So I grew up in suburban Boston, and it's an area where I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, with a large Jewish population. And I was often asked these sorts of questions like, well, aren't you Latina? How are you Jewish? Or something that I got a lot was, how can a white girl like you speak Spanish so well? This third quote is from one of my respondents that said to me that he had gone to a synagogue in Atlanta, and they said, "Oh, you're from Venezuela. Are you converting? That's so nice." And I remember thinking, growing up and sort of later in life, how odd that people didn't really know so much. Of course, there are always some people that do know, but many people didn't really realize that there are Jews all over the world, and there are a lot of Jews in Latin America. And also that we share a very close history. Some of I get a lot of emails from people saying, "Oh, are you a converso? You know, were you in Latin America during the Inquisition and or your family rather, obviously not me." But really, no, my family's from Eastern Europe. And when I was growing up in Newton, my grandparents were likely from very similar shtetls than, my classmates' grandparents were from. And our family's Jewishness was, for the most part, practiced in many of the same ways. But there was always something that was a little bit off. So I always struggled to sort of, I always struggled with defining an identity. Where am I from? Where do I fit in? This was identities become very important when you're in college and later graduate school. And I would join the Latin Student Association and always sort of feeling like a little bit of an imposter, like I didn't really belong. And so once I started my doctoral work many years later, I started really thinking about these larger questions of how we construct our sense of race or ethnicity or Jewishness. And I began to get the language to really ask about these sorts of questions. And so I started doing some preliminary research and found that many people who had similar backgrounds to mine had some of the same identity questions, issues of never really fitting in, changing identity. And as I was listening to the service tonight, I thought, something that struck me was this idea that Jewishness, not Judaism and Jewishness, doesn't come from above, and it's not universal, right? That we as people build what it means to be Jewish. And as a result, where we live, the national culture where we are found, is a factor in how Jewishness and Judaism is constructed. So the beginning of my research really set out to understand how people identify in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, how religion plays a role here, and how identity shifts in different situations. In what situations, for example, can I be an Argentine, a Latina, or my respondents be Mexican? When are they Jewish? Are they ever just American Jews? And then throughout the interviews, I really came to see how these questions led to even bigger ones about the role of ethnicity and ethno-religion in the process of assimilation. So I really set out to understand how these questions led to even bigger ones about ethnicity, ethno-religion, how this helps or doesn't help in the process of assimilation and the process of upward mobility, which is what sociologists often study in terms of among immigrants. And then I also wanted to know how ethno-religion and ethno-religious factors and the construction of ethno-religious communities came about. So I'm going to start off a little bit with just a little bit of background of the Jews in Latin America. So this is a photograph of the anniversary of Moisesville, which we can see right here. Moisesville was a colony started or funded by Baron Hirsch in Argentina in the 1800s. And many Argentine Jews came, left Eastern Europe, not just to Argentina, they're actually really all over the world to start these agricultural communities. But I put this picture up to really to think about, well, when did Jews come to Latin America? And they really came in many, for the same reasons that Jews came to the United States. They were fleeing. We tend to sort of talk about the political and the anti-Semitic pogroms, but we know that they were really fleeing from deep economic depression that was happening in Europe. So they sort of went wherever they could go. Argentina at the time, at the turn of the century, was doing very well economically. So if Jews could go there, they went there. My book has much more detail about the policies that different countries had at different times for accepting Jews and other immigrants. We see a big stream of migrants go to Mexico after the Mexican Revolution. Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, Colombia. We start to see even bigger migration streams after 1924, which was essentially when the borders closed here in the United States, pushed Jews in Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, and led them to come to the United States, also led them to Latin America. But the migration streams really have to do with what's going on in the world. But the difference is not where they came from, but rather what they came to. And this is where it gets important. And this is where we start to see a construction of a new kind of identity. So what we see in Latin America are countries with a strong deep to Catholicism and ties to colonial rule. Countries where the economy and the demographics are centralized, where the secular education is often not great. So what we find is that communities are built around what we call a Kehillah model. So really a central organizing institution that is kind of the umbrella institution that funds other kinds of arts, culture, synagogue, burial societies, all of those sorts of Jewish life institutions. And we know that Judaism in the United States, but particularly in Latin America, is an expression of ethnic culture and is highly influenced by local culture. And the difference really that has come to define Latin American Jews is that Jewish life in Latin America doesn't revolve around the synagogue in the way that it does in the United States for a myriad of reasons. Athletic clubs are very important. Schools are very important. In the 1960s and 70s, Zionist youth movements were very important. And as a result, we see a strong Jewish ethnic identity and ethnic group that begins to wane here in the United States. This is a picture of a photograph of the Argentine Jewish women's soccer team from an athletic club in front of the Western Wall. And this is how they define their Jewishness, right? As part of an Argentine Jewish women's soccer team. I don't know if any of you follow soccer, but you know, we in Latin America live and breathe and die soccer. There is a Jewish soccer team, not necessarily Jewish, but it's from the old Jewish neighborhood. And that becomes very different than what we see in the United States, where in the United States, religious pluralism is a norm enshrined in the Constitution. And this facilitated the change of Jews from an ethno-racial status to an ethno-religious one, which was very important for what we call the sort of whitening of Jews and the Jews becoming part of the mainstream. So in Latin America, we continue to have more closed communities, communities where institutions play an outsized role in provider of services, such as education, art, culture, and the ethnic communities are tightly bound. They're also much smaller. They tend to be concentrated in urban areas. The Jewish school network, been a lot written about Jewish schools and how this fosters a strong continuation of ethnic ties. And we don't have that in the United States. We have Jewish religious schools, we have some Jewish schools but most Jewish kids go to public school. Uh, and as the state becomes somebody that, somebody, we like to call the state a person, but really the state as an institution is not a provider of these services. We tend to rely on ethnic communities to provide them. At the same time, just like the soccer team, national culture plays a role in defining what it means to be Jewish. This here is a Mexican kosher taqueria in Mexico City, in an area that was largely the sort of Jewish neighborhood for many years, called Polanco. So what happens when they come here? Right, they come with a very strong Jewish identity, but also a very strong national identity and a very strong Latino identity, which they often encounter when they come here, right? We always say, oh, well, I'm Argentine or I'm Mexican in Mexico. It's not that until I cross the border that I become Latino. So I really wanted to know, well, when do you get to be Latino? When are you just Jewish? Do you ever become a Latino Jew? So in what circumstances are they able to highlight one ethnic or ethno-religious identity over another? And then I wanted to know, how does race play in the larger construction of what we call ascribed and assigned ethnicities, right? Who's able to choose? When do I get to choose if I'm Latina, or when do I get to choose if I am, for example, Jewish or white, or nobody needs to know because I'm white? Which is something that doesn't often happen with a larger non-Jewish Latino population. So I wanted to understand, do people ever just become a Latino Jew? So it's what we call pan-ethnicity, right? This idea that how does one become Latino? How do Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Argentines and Venezuelans and Colombians become part of one group? We see this particularly now when we talk about the Latino vote. Latinos are voting this way, but really we know that some Latinos are voting a completely other way than other Latinos might vote. In fact, Cubans and Venezuelans are much more likely to support a Republican candidate than, say, Mexicans or Argentines. So how does that happen? Do we actually, is this a real identity? Or is it just something that people give to you here in the United States? And the third thing I wanted to look at was really this idea of what we call ethnic capital, which I'll get into in just a minute. So being Jewish in the United States, I asked my respondents, well, do you feel Jewish? How do you feel? How is your Jewishness experience like the Jews here, and how do you feel differently? And this is one, I think you can probably see all of this, but one of my respondents, who's an Argentine woman that lives in Boston, said, you know, most Argentines don't go to synagogue to pray. She said, I don't even remember going very often. We have other ways to interact and be Jewish. And this was echoed across many of the countries, the respondents from different countries, that our whole world can be Jewish if we wanted to. So this woman went to Jewish school. She went to Hebraica, which is a community and athletic club in Buenos Aires. And in the United States, you don't have that. You have the JCC, which is kind of like a gym and also a preschool. And there loses a sense of community, institutional support for community building. So I think in that sense, the idea that the synagogue is how we are Jewish here, whatever kind of synagogue it may be, it might not be necessarily a synagogue where religion is the focus. It still continues to be the focus around which Jewish life is built. So this happened in, for many, there's lots and hosts of literature about how this happened and why this happened. And in large part, it's because, it's okay to be religious in the United States. And we don't need the kinds of institutions that or organizations that Latin American countries rely on. So, my son plays soccer here in Brooklyn at ASO. My daughter does dance at the local dance center. They go to they go to Jewish camp. Maybe I would send them to non-Jewish camp if that's what I had. They go to public school. Their Jewishness is really practiced at their 1 day, 2 day a week Hebrew school. That doesn't happen in Latin America. So I think that's the sort of biggest shift. And as a result, people sort of think, well, I don't feel so comfortable going into or that being my whole Jewish experience. That doesn't mean they don't join synagogues. It doesn't mean they don't belong to synagogues at different points in their lives. It doesn't mean they don't participate in Jewish life, but it does mean that they sometimes feel a little bit of an outsider. And at the same time, Jews, so there's also what came up a lot was this idea of when they're Jewish, right? So Jews in Latin America are very used to operating within a small-ish community where social ties are important. So we talk a lot about social capital in sociology. So we talk about, financial capital is sort of, I like to think of it as a coffer, right? So financial capital is really the money you have in your coffer. Then we have cultural capital, which is how much you know about certain things. Human capital is what you're able to do. And then we have social capital, that's really who you know. And social capital is important because it helps us get jobs, it helps us find a mate, it helps us in New York City maybe get an apartment. And immigrants really rely on social capital because as immigrants, we sort of, we need someone to teach us the ropes. And what happens with Jews oftentimes is that they rely on what I call ethnic capital. So this idea that not only are we exchanging information with people that we know, but we're doing it along ethnic lines, and in this case, Jewish lines. And this is quite common in Latin America, and Latin American Jews in the United States call on this as part of the migration process, right? As part of settling in, integrating, upward mobility, where to go to preschool, what neighborhood to live in, all of these things. And they signal to people that they're Jewish as a way to establish some sort of ethnic connection. At the same time, they have a strong Latino connection, right? So I love this quote where this is another Argentine professor who said to me, speaking Spanish creates a special, distinct connection. And she goes on to say, speaking Spanish establishes a kind of intimacy with servers that I enjoy. It's a pleasant, quick moment of intimacy. So it's these ideas that our life is sort of made up of small connections. And having a language is a bridge to somebody and to say, hey, I might look different, but actually we have a lot in common. And then when we talk about what it means to have a Latino identity, to some extent, we just said people vote differently. Venezuelans have a much different historical, political, and economic regime than, say, Peruvians. Their foods are different, the music is different, but language is key here. Because we're all aware of the same kind of music. We've all read the same books. The same TV shows are broadcast all over Latin America. I grew up watching Mexican novelas with my grandmother or my babi. The same way that somebody in Peru might have, or Chile. So, and that's how we learn about culture. And I think one way that Latino Jews see themselves as not being so American is this idea of really culture. So a woman I interviewed said, she's a Venezuelan Jew, said to me, you know, I have a Latina identity, the language, the way of dancing, the music, the values, but also the way I see life is intrinsically Latin. How I see the mystery life, everything, even how I laugh. And then she goes on to say, even how we die is different. So in that sense, people say, you know, yes, of course, I'm Jewish and I grew up eating knishes, maybe not bagels. We actually don't have a lot, our bagels are very different. So that was a nice surprise coming to the United States, how great the bagels are. But, you know, there's a lot of things that we practice the same. The songs are similar. We are Jewish, but our value system seems different. And in part because we're strongly influenced by national culture. My parents always have these big barbecues on their deck, and their neighbor always says to them, gosh, you Latinos you eat really late. You really have a lot of parties. So there's this idea that, you know, Latinos are loud and they have parties. And you know, interestingly enough, I would say that it's not a stereotype. That's not true. There is some truth to this. We might be louder. Family is very important. It's the sort of, to move away from your family to go to college might be done, but it's not common, not just among Jews, but really all over Latin America, to necessarily have to live far from your family. This is not common. So in this sense, people say, well, I feel like my values are different from what I think about as American values. And then I think one very interesting thing and important thing that came up is how race, class, and privilege intersect with forming an identity. So Latino Jews, not all, but many, are phenotypically white, or they resemble the white mainstream. And that allots people a lot of privilege. So, and being Jewish is also a signal to say, well, I might be Mexican, but actually I'm Jewish. So people might sort of signal that in their place of work, or among other Jews, or just to let everybody know, well, you know, I am different from Latinos that are just, you know, that are racially and ethnically marginalized in many ways in the United States. So people use there's a very strong class system in Latin America, particularly in Mexico and Venezuela, where many of my respondents came from. And they often use these class schemes, let's say, to differentiate their position vis-a-vis other people. And while they might never be of the super elite because they're not the old white Catholic families, they're very much middle class, upper middle class, and often will signal that they're educated, they're middle class, they're upper middle class, therefore they're different. So that is, I think, one way that folks absolutely use their racial privilege in constructing an identity. And another thing that came up a lot was, well, I would ask my respondents, well, do you check off Latino if it gives you an advantage? And the majority said, oh, absolutely. If it's going to give me an edge in getting into school and getting into, you know, even in New York City here, when getting into preschool is difficult. So any sort of edge you can have, people will take, which of course begs the bigger question of, you know, who does affirmative action really serve? And it was for sure not set up to serve new middle class immigrants from that have come in the last 20, 30 years. So I really wanted to know, okay, so sometimes people feel Jewish, sometimes they feel Latino, sometimes they feel Mexican. It sort of depends on the situation. It depends who they're interacting with. It depends how much they're able to choose. But do we ever see people identifying or constructing a Latino Jewish identity? And what I found is that these ethnicity and ethnic communities, the construction of and ethnicity and ethnic communities really depends on demographics, historical timeline, and location and geography. So I'm going to unpack that for you. What do I mean by that? So who immigrates? When are they immigrating to? At what point, both in their lives, but at what point, what does it look like in terms of the historical timeline of the existing community when they're immigrating? And where are they immigrating to? Where do they land? What does the geography look like when they land? So by who I want to, I was interested, or what I found really was that it really differed if people immigrated by themselves or with their families, because they had different needs. Where they immigrated to, what does the city look like? What does the town look like? Are there opportunities to meet people like them? Is it hard to get around? Do they have a choice on where they're living? And when? I was particularly interested in what the Jewish community looked like when they immigrated. So when they immigrated, where was the Jewish community at the time? Was it a big and vibrant community? Did it offer a lot? Or was it a dying community? So my research took place in 4 places: Boston, New York, South Florida, and California. I'm just going to talk here about New York City and South Florida. So I always put this photograph up because New York City is pretty vast and pretty hard to get around. But the first thing I want to talk about is who comes to New York. We all live in New York, and it's an expensive and hard place to come to. In fact, most people that come with most immigrants that come, those that are Latino Jews, will come either with a partner or by themselves to study, to go to a graduate program, or with a job. They're much less likely to come with their families, and most that come with their families often just go straight to the suburbs because, getting an apartment that's big enough for a family in New York City as an immigrant is tough. What this means, and we know this from other literature that looks at when people turn to religious institutions and ethnic institutions, is that singles and couples are much less likely to need a synagogue, a JCC. Doesn't mean that they don't go to meet people, but really, it's families. Oftentimes when we come back to a synagogue or a church or a place of worship, it's during certain times in our lives. And oftentimes it happens when people get married or have kids, or then later in life. So there's sort of already that barrier to meeting other people like them, right? I really wanted to know, I would ask people, do you hang out with other Jews from Latin America? Do you know other Mexican Jews or Venezuelan Jews? And, some did, but I think many of them found community in other places. Also, they work a lot. When you're a 20-something, 30-something immigrant that comes to New York to work for a professional job, you're working a lot, or you're in school. And in school, we find community in whatever program you might be in. They make friends there. They also come to New York City, and I think this was very interesting. New York City is a Jewish town. One respondent said to me, I don't have to do anything Jewish here. Just being in New York makes me Jewish. Everybody speaks a little Yiddish. They sell knishes on, from the food vendors. You feel Jewish being here. I did my undergrad at Brandeis, and it was sort of very similar. It was like, everyone's a Jew, so I don't have to do anything. I just am. And people say that about New York too, especially immigrants that come from Latin America, where nothing is Jewish in the same way. And then there's as a result very little institutional support for Jewish Latinos, and in fact, the institutional support that existed really no longer exists. And New York City is a big, big place. So I said before, part of it is, do we have a choice of where we can live? It's big, it's expensive. And oftentimes we don't have a choice. We sort of live where we can get an apartment, which doesn't obviously foment a community of neighbors. And again, I don't want to say that this doesn't mean that people don't meet and there aren't friendships, but I found that without institutional support, it really didn't happen. And the one place in New York City that gives this kind of support is something called the Jewish Latin Center, which is a Chabad organization down on 23rd Street. So this is a Purim party. And I started doing research there years ago. And at first I would go and you would have sort of different tables of people from the same national origin country. So the Venezuelans sat with Venezuelans, and the Colombians with Colombians, and the Argentines with Argentines. But over time, as more and more people went, they became a real community. And there was more intermingling. So we sociologists say, well, what we talk about assimilation is when people start to intermarry. So this is sort of marrying across country origin lines. So now there have been many couples that have married, an Argentine marrying a Mexican, or Venezuelan and a Peruvian. And this is when you really start to see what we call pan-ethnicity, right? This idea that people build an ethnic identity where they share values, they share culture, they share language, they share foods and community across different national origin lines. But the big difference was New York with South Florida. So Aventura is a little small town right north of Sunny Isles. And it's always had a strong Latin American Jewish presence, in part because Miami is easy to get to. It's an easy entry. The cost of entry to South Florida is much easier. You don't need to speak English. In fact, if you don't speak Spanish, you're likely at a disadvantage. Many people bought homes here. So when they were leaving their country, they were leaving Mexico, they maybe already had a family home in this area. So on the one hand, you have people that come as families because the cost of entry is much lower. You don't necessarily have people that are coming to study or with jobs. Oftentimes you have people that are coming as entrepreneurs. And there's a bigger need for community. So the demographics are already different. But what else happens is what Aventura looked like. So Aventura and much of Miami has an aging Jewish population. So the synagogues were losing people. So there really wasn't a strong, vibrant Jewish community, which means it was sort of prime for Latino Jews to come in and make community. And this happened across many, really not many, there's just not that many Jews in the world, not that many Latino Jews, but it happened across 3 or 4 synagogues in the area. It also happened at the local JCC, which had a branch of Hebraica, where they do Spanish language programming, where they do many of the same kinds of programs that they have in Latin America. It happened at the schools. So the schools, remember I said in Latin America, one of the things that really fomented community was Jewish schools, in large part because the state schools were not very good. Or they were on strike for months at a time, or many different reasons why people didn't send their kids to state schools. Well, the state schools in Aventura were not great either. They're getting better, so we'll see what happens. But the Latino Jews that came to the area started going to the local Jewish schools, to the point where non-Latin Jews started taking their kids out because they'd say, well, everyone speaks Spanish. I don't feel at home there anymore. And it wasn't just one national origin. You have Venezuelan Jews and Mexican Jews and Argentine Jews at a school. And this, again, is what foments pan-ethnicity. And then the geography is also very different from what it is in New York. So many of these, it's much smaller, it's easier to get around, and many of these buildings are built around what we call public-private spaces, or public-private spaces. So people really have a chance to congregate, to get to know each other in ways that they don't get to know each other in New York City. It's a safe space, it's in their own building, but you hear somebody speaking Spanish and you'll say, oh, I'm from here. Oh, you're from here. And then you'll ask their name, and then it comes out that they're Jewish. And now you start to build community. And what we've seen in this area is a real sense of Latino Jewish community, where people come together from all different countries, speak Spanish, intermarry, so marry across national origin lines, and their kids have now become friends, and they have a new culture. It's not they don't lose their Venezuelan Jewish culture, but they speak Spanish. They speak Spanish with the different modalities, and they adopt different foods, and they begin to feel like they're part of a group that was constructed here in the United States. So this is, there's a lot of programming that, when we think about institutional support, there's a lot of programming that also works to really foment this kind of pan-ethnicity. And this is one of the temples here has, the rabbi is from Argentina. He has people from all over Latin America come, and he holds services in Spanish, and he holds services in English, and he has a lot of Spanish programming, which attracts Jews from all over Latin America. So some concluding thoughts, and I'll stop here, is that, ethnicity matters, and so does race. So who can access certain ethnicities and when is an important factor in immigrant upward mobility. Being Latino, but also being Jewish, gives people much wider access to a social network. It can often be a conduit to social mobility, and it's an exchange of capital. But it also is this ethnic identity fortifies a sense of self, which is also important in immigrants' journeys. So I think we often leave out how people see themselves as part of a group. And when these larger Jewish Latino groups are formed, people feel as if they have a bigger sense of belonging in their new country. But it is a racially privileged group of people. And it's a group of people that benefits from a class structure and a racial structure that privileges them. I think the larger questions are going to be, what happens to the second generation, to these kids? Will they be Jewish? Will they be Latino? Will it even matter? Will it be strong in South Florida and non-existent anywhere else? We don't know. And I do want to add that all of this research took place before the Trump era, where I think where we see Jews today, and the racially privileged status of Jews is contested to some extent, and it's not as Jews are less likely to be seen as part of the white mainstream in many places. But I think the places where Latino Jews congregate, Jews continue to be primarily accepted as part of the larger white mainstream and privilege from that. So that is all. Thank you.